So it's really a huge pleasure for me to hear and talk to people I truly respect, immensely accomplished people. I know you're speaking in your personal capacities. I don't know, Steve, if you need some sort of corporate disclaimer there.
Capacity. That's enough.
Each of you, as Dr. Kang pointed out, worked for administrations of different parties. This isn't, though, a campaign event. It's not a debate between the Trump and the Harris camp. What unifies everyone in the political arena is the fact that we're focused on the best interests of the Republic of the United States. And a huge element in calculating our interests lies in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific. And that's what I hope we will talk about, although in the Q&A we'll see where your interest takes us. So let's get to it. And I'd really like to start with first principles. The title of the program itself asks questions about U.S. leadership in Asia in particular, and its enduring qualities. And I'll start, if I can, Wendy, with you, with a pretty basic question, namely leadership. We hear about a lot, we talk about a lot, but in this context, what are we really talking about? What is the leadership? Where are we trying to lead? What do we mean by that?
Thank you. First of all, it's just terrific to be here, to be with Danny Russel, who was Assistant Secretary Danny Russel, among many other things, and will know more about Asia and leadership in Asia than I ever will. So I'm delighted to be here with him. And Steve Biegun and I, we go way back to when he was on Capitol Hill, and we disagreed violently about many things. But I have to say that when people ask me about Steve, I say first and foremost, he is a professional who cares about the security of our country. And when I was going to become Deputy Secretary of State, he gave me all the time that I asked for to talk about what had transpired. And I would say today, Steve and I probably have more in common than we have difference because of the challenges in front of the country. And I want to say one thing about Dr. Kang. I have had the pleasure of knowing Dr. Kang since she was an interpreter for Kim Dae-jung. She was such a brilliant interpreter that then leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-il, turned to me and Madeleine Albright and said, I don't think my interpreter is as good as hers, as good as his. She was, even if you don't speak the language, you can tell who is who understands beyond the words what's happening and what's necessary. And quite frankly, in my experience, interpreters have often been the best negotiators because they get everything that's happening at the table and outside the table. And of course, Dr. Kang went on to be foreign minister, and we are very fortunate and a great partner to Steve when he tried to move us forward in this arena. So leadership in Asia. And forgive my lovely boot, I'm sure you all have worn it at one time or another. I managed to break a toe, and when you break a toe, what you have to do is wear this enormous boot to get it healed quickly. I'm fine, though. It's just annoying. I think that what we have tried to do in this administration, President Biden, Vice President Harris, Secretary Blinken, Secretary Austin, and I would say, importantly, Secretary Raimondo and Secretary Yellen, is to really build the partnerships and alliances in the Indo-Pacific. We already live in a geopolitical changed world. We also already live in a multipolar world. The United States is undoubtedly the strongest economy in the world. Steve knows that better than I, given his current job. We have an extraordinary military, the greatest military in the world. But we all understand that the pacing challenge for America, as Secretary Austin first said, is China. And so the United States is obliged, in my view, to build that relationship as best we can, to align ourselves with others around the world in our objectives vis-a-vis China, to increase our own infrastructure and capacity, to make sure that we have a secure America. We certainly learned during the pandemic that we have to be conscious of our supply chain, and if we can't have it here, we better have it in one of our partner countries. We have to compete where we must, and we have to try to avoid conflict, if at all possible, because conflict with China, as it grows its military very quickly, would be, I think, terrible and catastrophic for everyone, China and the United States included. But the last point I want to make before stopping, because I don't want to monopolize things, is I don't think leadership in Asia is just about China. As I was thinking about this evening, I was thinking about India, who just came to an agreement ostensibly on the line of control with China. I was thinking about India and its growth and its leadership and its changing from just a regional power to trying to exert some control as a global power. I think about Indonesia, which has a new president and is the third largest Muslim country in the world, which has a capacity to be more consequential than perhaps it has been in the past. I think of Vietnam, which has become a leader in ASEAN and a country which wants to see its own growth while hedging on its relationship with China. I think of the Pacific Islands, which I had a chance to visit, which the United States for too long, I think, did not pay enough attention to, and understand what they're trying to do and the existential threat they feel from climate change, a place where the United States must exert leadership. So I think our leadership is crucial, and we have to build a floor. Right now it's a floor made of plywood, I would say, with China, not mahogany or oak. But we owe it to the world to make sure there is a floor, that we avoid conflict, that we compete as we need to, that we take care of our own country and build our own infrastructure and capacity to be able to compete and to deal as necessary with any conflict. And then the last point is, I think China is trying to move out in leadership roles it has never wanted to have before. It was thrilled to appear to have brought together Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, we can unpack that and what really happened there, but it was a feeler to say they could do things perhaps we could not, and so we have to pay attention to China's emerging leadership in a way that perhaps it has not in the past. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So that's very interesting. I'm hearing both the agenda-setting role of leadership, but also the multipolar dimension of it. The fact, that the leadership or the engagement of middle powers like Indonesia and India are powerful factors, that it's not a U.S. go-it-alone approach, but also that thinking of and leveraging our strengths in the best interests of sub-regions, disadvantaged regions like the Pacific Islands is sort of part of the American obligation. So that's interesting. Steve, same topic. How do you think about American leadership, particularly at this moment?
So it's a big question, American leadership in Asia, because there's a lot of different parts of Asia. So American leadership with Myanmar is going to look very different than, say, American leadership with Republic of Korea. There are some general tenets of American leadership that I think don't even apply just to Asia, but global. It's things as Wendy referenced, for example, the strength of our economy, the strength of our military. I think those are very important and equally important in today's world. There's there's also the strength of our example. And this is a place where we've had some challenges. But demonstrating that the democratic system in the United States government provides the best outcome for the American people is an imperative for us. You know, our system, our devotion isn't to democracy per se, it's to the idea that democracy delivers the best outcomes for the people. That's really what we're focused on. And so we need to nurture and tend to our democracy and get those outcomes, whether it comes in the form of prosperity or equality. That a power of example is a very important part of our leadership in Asia. I think we need to use our resources judiciously. We have, with a little bit of humility, lost or unsuccessful wars have done more to diminish America's leadership credibility in the world than anything else in recent years in my career. You know, said perhaps more crassly, our partners want to know that they're betting on a winner. Yeah. And so, does that mean we should win our wars? Well, that means we should be very judicious about when we decide to go to that level of engagement or action in foreign policy. You know, so leadership comes a lot of different ways, and also, you know, this is perhaps me, the optimist, but I think we also have to have a little bit more altruism and a little more listening in our leadership style, and I think that gets us a long way. We have, you know, I mentioned that we have a complex Asia. There's not one Asia, but there you can lump it into, you know, countries that are problematic, countries that are allies, and countries that are in the middle. And we're really going to have to work hard to own that middle, and how we lead is going to be very important with them. There's one last thing that I think really challenges us, and it seems absurdly simple, but it's the tyranny of distance. Our ability to engage consistently with Asian partners is just challenged by the sheer distance. Some of it is also organizational inside our government, but Wendy and I have tried to persuade presidents to do bilateral visits and summits for as long as we've worked in Washington. You're fighting against other scheduling priorities, you're fighting against events happening in the Congress or elsewhere in the world. Most recently, President Biden canceled a trip because of the hurricane and the natural disaster that imposed itself on the country, but we've had congressional shutdowns, budget shutdowns that lead presidents to cancel their trips. And being present really matters in Asia. I've thought about this a lot. How do we conquer that? Of course, you need senior empowered officials, and I really admire how the Biden administration organized itself to add the complement of Kurt Campbell as the Asia coordinator in the White House, which I think really amplified America's engagement with Asia and got us a lot of progress. But I would love to see a position like Kurt's actually in Asia. I think we have to find ways to be more present because the distances are so great.
Interesting.
That's a very good point.
So you mentioned, Steve, the tyranny of distance. My hypothesis is that China suffers from the home court disadvantage. To be
So be
cheek
careful
and
what you
jowl,
ask for.
to be cheek by jowl with the People's Republic of China is not an unalloyed joy, and I think there's a lot more tolerance for America, given that not only I think are we benign in terms of territorial ambition, et cetera, but there is a healthy distance, I think, that may work to our advantage in some respects. But you made another interesting point about how we lead and the fact that it's really listening that unlocks people's brains. They really can't, I would say as a diplomat, they really can't hear you until they've unburdened themselves of some of the things that they want you to hear from them. So that's a good salutary lesson. There's also, as you mentioned, the issue of the credibility of our example, the power of our economy, the strength of our military. And I think the new factor, if I had to assess what it is that most countries in Asia really want from us, it's in the technology space. The notion that it just may be that the U.S. is going to pull yet another rabbit out of Lee Kuan Yew's sort of black box of American miracles, and that it does lie in technology. And what I hear from, for example, Southeast Asian governments is they want in on the next revolution. So you've talked about the how to some degree, and when you've just come out of government, do you have more thoughts about the how in terms of the exercise of leadership? Not to mention cloning Kurt and stationing him in the Pacific.
So actually, that point, we had a very intense discussion once, I think way back when I was Madeline's counselor, about whether we should post assistant secretaries in the region as opposed to have them in Washington.
Like combatant commanders.
Like combatant commanders. And for the reasons of proximity, the reasons of time, but at the end of the day, being available to Washington policymakers won out. But it is worth thinking through whether we have the best model to do this in this kind of world where presence does matter tremendously, and going there, being there, but able to come home with that information is critical. You know, the reason that we as diplomats are on airplanes so much is because it's not enough. Zoom is fabulous, and it certainly saved us during the pandemic, but it is not the same. And during the pandemic, I went to China. John Kerry had gone to meet with his counterpart, but I was the first senior official to go. He went on climate, but I was the first senior official to go. And when I went, I was met by 10 guys in full hazmat suits, including gloves and helmets. My driver wore gloves and helmets. It was very difficult, but the fact that we went and spent time, had a 4-hour session with Jiafang because he spoke only in Chinese, and so interpretation means it takes 4 hours to get 2 hours of conversation. And then I had 2 hours in English with Wang Yi, whom I'd known because of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action Iran negotiation. And that discussion was the beginning of moving towards a relationship that got derailed by a balloon. Unbeknownst to everybody, I think Secretary Blinken and I were about to get on an airplane to go to China when that balloon came across the country, and we felt we had no choice but to cancel the visit, postpone the visit. Sorry, got to watch that language. Postpone the visit. So I think physical presence matters. I think making sure that the agenda is an all-of-government agenda. And the reason I mentioned Secretary Yellen, and particularly Secretary Raimondo, is that the Commerce Secretary and the Treasury Secretary play a very, very critical role in the point that Steve made. We have to be able to deliver. Democracy has to be able to deliver. And much of the assistance we give around the world, we give multilaterally, not bilaterally. We give to organizations, whether it's the WHO or the UN or any multilateral organization. We do some bilateral assistance, but not in the same way that China does. Most of their assistance is bilateral. And so we have to find other ways to make sure that we engage. And so the president did a Pacific Islands summit. He did an ASEAN summit. He went to the region. We created IPEF. We created the Asia Quad. We created AUKUS. Different vehicles to try to engage all of the players in Asia to try to move all of our agendas forward, and theirs as well.
That's so interesting. You really brought home, first of all, the easily overlooked but really important point that leaders are human and diplomacy and government is conducted by humans, and the kind of relationship that you had built over time with, say, Wang Yi really made the difference between 4 hours of reading from the catechism and 2 hours of having a conversation, however testy and combative it might be. That's a super important point. Secondly, I assert that the United States, by virtue of our melting pot society, is kind of hardwired for diversity. And whether it's an embassy country team, where you've got players from, not only are they personally diverse, but representing different agencies of government and different priorities, or the sit room where the two of you spent so many hours that you'll never get back to in your life. This notion that we collectively meet to hash out policy questions is not standard in all governments, and I think it's a comparative advantage for us, including in dealing, for example, with the Chinese.
If we can get out of our own way, though, and unlock that talent. We have organizational challenges, but also something that I was very proud that you guys got across the line. I was very proud that we started it, was that you got the assignment restrictions erased. So we used to prohibit people of certain heritage from serving in the country of their ethnicity. The theory was multifaceted. The most worrisome, at least as it was expressed, was that they would be susceptible to being compromised or
Blackmailed.
About blackmail or betrayal. Also, that there might be some sympathies to one's country of origin, or at least heritage, and so on. But we're talking about American citizens here, and it just, when I heard about this as deputy secretary, I just thought it violated my sense of what we provide to our citizens. They're Americans.
That's a really good point.
I don't care the heritage. I don't care the ethnicity. They're Americans. And it was absurd that we didn't allow Chinese Americans to serve in China when that was our strongest asset we could bring to the table. People who understood the culture, people who understood the language, people who loved America. How can you beat that? And so we pushed very hard against a lot of reservations, including in part of the security institutions in our country. And in the Biden administration, about a year and a half ago, they finally succeeded in finalizing it, and those restrictions are removed. And it's not just China; it's all over Latin America. America is a melting pot. But this is what I mean by getting out of our own way and unlocking the talent that we have. It's a huge advantage to us. You don't have an Anglo-American diplomat from China coming and talking to me, but we can have people who speak Mandarin fluently, who understand China intuitively, and go there and communicate on behalf of the United States of America. I think that's a huge asset to us.
I agree.
I agree.
I agree.
Well, you are, Steve, emphasizing the importance of being able to speak to a foreign audience. Wendy's alluded to altruism in our foreign policy, the fact that we're looking at and out for the interests of others besides just ourselves. But talk to us for a minute as Americans. How do you make the case? What's the value proposition for, no kidding, American citizens who are not foreign policy wonks, for why all this investment in Asia, in Asian engagement, in Asian diplomacy, why that's really worthwhile? We're at a political moment, I think, where this is being contested.
So in defiance of all logic, there are voices that would say that the past 75 years of the post-World War II period have been an unfair imposition on the United States of America. And I'm just stunned that somebody could look at the world today and how purpose-built it is for American success. And they could question those fundamentals, that the evidence is in front of our nose, for goodness sake. The prosperity in this country, our ability to shape events around the world in advance, with hopefully to be successful in avoiding conflicts, in advancing not just the benefit of the American people, but the benefit of global populations. I mean, China rightfully is proud of having brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But China didn't do that without us being engaged with China in particularly economically, in helping facilitate and transform that. These newly prosperous and successful societies that we see across Asia, long-standing allies like Australia, the Republic of Korea, Japan, others, are a huge benefit to us. This is the part of the world that represents a plurality of all global trade. This is a part of the world that represents a majority of the global population. It is there for us to creatively find ways to build our own success in that environment. In the more worrisome side of affairs, forming close friendships and partnerships with other cases in Asia can help us deter a worst case scenario with China. It strikes me as particularly puzzling that those who would question the principles and practices that have built a world over 75 years that is fit for purpose to serve American interests would at the same time raise the most alarming concerns about the People's Republic of China. It's hard for me to hold those two thoughts in my head at the same time. We need friends, partners, and allies if we are going to effectively deter China, should China continue to develop in a way that has the potential to be a threat to the United States of America. Simply put.
Wendy, what are your thoughts? Do you think that the way to make the case of the value, the return on the investment of our engagement in Asia is sort of defensive vis-a-vis China? Is it based on American values? Is it a kind of a hard-nosed economic, commercial argument? What's
First of all, I think Steve and I can use each other's talking points. I could say exactly what Steve just said about the importance of allies and partners, about understanding our power. President Biden has said often, it is not the example of our power, it's the power of our example. Words that Steve used just a moment ago. We bring a lot to the table, and we should be proud of that, and at the same time listen and be humble in our power to change the world. People are at different places, and here in the United States, on a day-to-day basis, most Americans do not vote on the basis of national security and foreign policy. The data shows that they don't. What they do vote on is America being safe, secure. Americans don't want to send our men and women abroad to fight wars. We want to make sure that we can, having gone through the pandemic, we are self-sufficient enough to make sure that we are not reliant on people who may not help us. But day in and day out, the things that people care about are the price of eggs. And there is no question that the era of globalization, which we all were fans of, including in Asia. I remember a Pew study a long time ago when the Vietnamese said the thing they liked best about globalization were cell phones. But only 10% of Vietnamese at the time had cell phones. It was the notion of being part of the world and notion of gaining from the world. So most Americans do not see the advantages of that part of our history. And so part of what I think we're talking to Americans about is we are not decoupled or disconnected from China in terms of our economy or from others in terms of our economy. We have to, as von der Leyen of the EU says, we have to de-risk. We have to make sure we are not reliant on those economic trends, that we are not fully reliant on the patterns of globalization, that we make sure that we have enough for ourselves. But our greatness is because we are the strong country we are, the great economy we are, the great military that we are. And we are not disconnected from the rest of the world. I think climate change is probably the most profound, particularly for young people in this country, and understanding that the Hurricane Helene and the Hurricane Milton that were just devastating beyond what anyone expected is because everything will be more intense. And climate comes from other places. It doesn't just come here. It's something that we have to do as a world, not just as a country. And I do think Americans do understand that in the way that they understand that terrorism doesn't start just here, though we have lone wolf terrorists here, but it comes from other parts of the world, as we experienced in 9/11. So I think there are some connections for Americans, but I don't think any of us in national security and foreign policy should diminish the fact that most Americans want to make sure that they can raise their families, have a good job, have a home, have security, be safe, and have a good future, and that the future for their kids will be even better than their own lives.
So that's a great perspective on the domestic audience, for one thing. Also on the importance of connectivity and in the economy, in security. I would add to that list the tremendous value that the U.S. Consistently derives from the import of talent we get from immigration and from the students from all over the region who flock to the United States, who hopefully stay and add so much value here. Turning to the big Asian actor, China. We're talking about leadership. Steve, do you have a working hypothesis about what the Chinese vision for their leadership looks like?
Yeah, so this is much debated, and I would say inside the Republican ranks, I'm probably a minority, but I think the Chinese primary interest is regional hegemony. They want global deterrence. They want regional hegemony. China wants a free hand to pursue its own interests in the Indo-Pacific without the United States being in a strong position to resist it. And so China will build up and is building up its capabilities in the Indo-Pacific. It's also building up its strategic nuclear forces. And my analysis of that is that they want to deter us globally, so that for example, were the Chinese government to decide to make a move on Taiwan, that or if there was a clash in the South China Sea, that we would have to contemplate the full application of our military resources to turn back such a military action by China. We'd have to hedge against the risks of escalation and elevation of nuclear war. And so obviously something that is deeply in our interest to avoid, needless to say, and likewise for the Chinese. And so what I hope is that we can find a way to engage the Chinese in important areas of mutual interest, not just climate, but also nonproliferation, strategic stability, which is an antecedent to arms control, but strategic stability is understanding how decision-making happens in each other's respective systems and building crisis management breaks into that so that you don't have two ships collide in the South China Sea and 2 weeks later countries are threatening to use their missiles against each other. You want to build breaks into the system, and I think there's a lot of work we can do on that. But I digress a little bit here. The concern I have plenty of concerns even with what I consider to be a more minimalist assessment of China, which is regional hegemony and global deterrence.
Well, the challenge of strategic security, of course, is China, and whether they want and would be willing to allow us the access or allow us to insert those fire breaks, or whether they're gambling in a game of chicken on us being the responsible parties who are always going to divert.
Engagement, which I'm an advocate for, is only one element of it. My view of our policy, so you asked me my hypothesis on the Chinese policy, my view on our policy should stand on three different pillars. The first is deterrence. We have to have a meaningful deterrent that prevents China from making the mistake of starting a war in Asia. And so we have to robustly fund our military presence. We have to have strong friendships, alliances, and partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, not to threaten China, but to make it clear that there's just no profit from moving on Taiwan or from a further aggression or assertion of their demands in the South China Sea. I consider deterrence, incidentally, to be the foundation of peace. So first is deterrence. Second, we have to compete. We have to do a lot of the things we're doing already. We have to do them well. We have to execute. I think we tend to be overly pessimistic about our own condition. But like you said, it seems that in this new generation of technology, with some concerns about it, we're pulling another rabbit out of the hat. That we're still leading in ways that America's innovative society has allowed us to do a very long time. We need to transform that into competition, being competitive. And the third pillar is engagement. And I do believe engagement with China has benefit for us, in part because engagement is part of competition, and engagement is also part of deterrence. We don't just want to have the capabilities that would warn China not to move past a certain point. We want the Chinese to understand we have those abilities. Not, again, because we want to use them. God forbid. The last thing that I would want is for us to go to war with China. It would be catastrophic for us and for China. But if I look back on the conflict in Ukraine and what I consider to be one of the fundamental failings that led to that war, it was the failure of deterrence. I'm not blaming us for that. There was only one person who was responsible for the decision to brutally invade a neighboring country. But you can't dispute that deterrence failed. Putin did not believe that he was going to pay a high enough price to deter him from taking that action. And we now know, we knew it then too, that once you cross that threshold, you can't put the toothpaste back in the toothpaste tube. How do we end this war in Ukraine? We're going to be thinking about this for the next several years, if not decade. We have to make sure a war doesn't happen in Asia, and that starts with deterrence.
Thank you. Well, there's a lot there. Deterrence, partnerships that contribute to restraint, competition and effective competition, engagement. I am also a believer of the principle that telepathy is an inadequate tool for communicating with another major power.
Surely they know what we're thinking.
Yeah.
I'd say telepathy
Please.
is not a good tool, and I agree. It's interesting. Steve and I have come to violent agreement on too many things here tonight. So,
for the days of yore when we used to argue
right.
about this stuff.
this stuff, but not anymore.
My fault, I'm sure.
I think it is also critical in achieving the kinds of things that Steve was laying out, to build those other alliances and partnerships. And it creates a competition of its own, and we're seeing some of that now, which I think a lot of people are doing work on, which is the partnerships between China and Russia, Iran and North Korea, whether they are real partnerships, whether they are just transactional, common interest moments, how meaningful they are, where things will head. I know right now South Korea is saying there are 1,500 North Korean troops in Ukraine. Zelensky has said that. Our intelligence services are not confirming that at this point. South Korea said they must leave. I understand South Korea's concern. What China's doing is making South Korea a greater supporter of the United States and Zelensky in the war against Putin. So it's not having the effect, I think, that was hoped for. The only good news I can see out of these four countries dealing with each other in new ways that we all need to think very hard about is that China's probably a little pissed off that North Korea and Russia have gotten closer because North Korea, I think China saw as its chip on the board and not Russia's chip on the board. In the past, China has sort of come in behind Russia where Iran was concerned, where Europe was concerned, and Russia would become behind China where North Korea was concerned, with China in the lead. Those dynamics may have changed a little bit now, and I think, I don't have the answer sitting here tonight, but I think we all have to think very hard about what's real about these relationships, what's not, how it changes things or doesn't change things. I don't think we all should rush to conclusions, but I think a lot of hard work needs to be put in this, because if they are real, if it has really changed the dynamics, it will have consequences for what we do in Asia, how we proceed in Asia, how we think about these interrelationships, and what it means for our security.
You know, Wendy raises the interconnectedness of all of this, because it's not just about Asia, and it's not just about us. And I've thought about this, and I actually think our most effective China policy is to defeat Russia in Ukraine. If Russia is defeated in Ukraine, every challenge we face in the world today gets easier to resolve. Not easy to resolve, but easier. North Korea, how to engage and deter China. Iran, Syria. There's not a problem in the world that doesn't get at least easier to solve. And conversely, there's not a problem in the world that doesn't get much harder to solve if Vladimir Putin is successful in subverting the country of Ukraine. It will be very different, a very different world. As I mentioned earlier, that countries want to be associated with winners. If Russia is victorious in this war, and we think we have issues in what the so-called global South, just wait till Vladimir Putin is victorious in the war in Ukraine, and you're going to really see how much other countries like to be associated with winners.
Well, just coming back from Southeast Asia and round of conversations, I can certainly testify to the extent to which countries and governments are focused on that question, on how the Russian aggression against the Ukraine is going to end, and clearly with profound implications for American leadership perception. Wendy, you raised North Korea. I think the Earth is wobbling on its axis because with Dr. Kong here, the amount of North Korea experience and expertise in this room is maybe disrupting the force. So before we turn to Q&A and invite you all to gather your most insightful and thoughtful questions, we'll turn to you all in a moment. But I want to ask each of you, in light of your really formidable experience, to talk a little bit about how and what a new administration could do differently, could do more of, that might make a difference in deterring and in defending against North Korea, which so shows all the warning signs of being on the cusp of maturing or perfecting a nuclear triad, and has a nasty record of exploding into provocative mode.
Yes, when I think about black swan events, terrible things that could happen, North Korea is at the top of my list. I give enormous credit to Steve, along with Dr. Kong, for their efforts during the Trump administration. I publicly supported former President Trump having his meeting with Kim Jong-un, because I know that North Koreans, from my own experience with his father, believe that only leaders can make decisions. And so I thought, maybe if the United States goes with a plan that has been well coordinated with our allies and partners, that something could happen. I know, and Steve can speak for himself, that there was a plan, that there was hard work. I'll leave it to him why it didn't get to the end of the story. But there was a serious effort. From the outside, I would say there wasn't enough of a commitment to the team being able to continue to do the work with the authority necessary to get the job done.
On our side or on their side?
On our side. Not that Steve Biegun wasn't superb at what he does, he is, but whether former President Trump really handed the team the authority and was ready to make a hard decision, because it was a hard decision. And it takes, presidents have to have courage to make these hard decisions. President Obama had a lot of courage on the Iran nuclear deal. He knew every single piece of it and made very tough calls all the way along. It's why it took not 6 months to get the final Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but 18 months, because there were demands that we meet certain thresholds. Mm-hmm. It was hard work. So you have to be in it to do all of that hard work, and presidents have to make that decision ultimately and give the team the authority to do that hard work. I am very skeptical, sadly, and why Steve's point about deterrence is so critical, that Kim Jong-un wants to engage in some diplomatic deal. I hope I'm wrong about that. I hope China will engage in that regard, but I'm not sure they will. And right now, I feel that Kim Jong-un is doing everything he can to signal that it is a new time and a new era, blowing up the relationship, or what fragments were left of it, with the Republic of Korea. I'm very glad for the trilateral that got created during the Biden administration, that we were all so deeply engaged in. I give great thanks to Kishida and Yoon, because I think at a very personal level they worked incredibly hard to make that happen. But I'm pretty skeptical right now of the way forward beyond ensuring that we build deterrence as strongly as we can. And if there is an opportunity, be ready for it, be prepared for it, be ready to do the hard work to take that opportunity. But I don't see Kim Jong-un raring to go. And it takes two to tango.
So Wendy has said some very kind things tonight about me, and I thank you for that. We're old friends. But I have to say, on one of these points, I actually did have all the backing I could have hoped for from both the President and the Secretary of State on the North Korea negotiations. It's not to say we had universal consensus inside the executive branch, but that was never the fundamental challenge. The fundamental challenge we had is what Wendy just alluded to. It takes two to tango. The North Koreans do get a say in this, and I sat in the summit meetings in Hanoi, which were not our last meetings. Incidentally, President Trump subsequently met with Kim Jong-un at the DMZ in June of 2019 in an impromptu meeting during a state visit to South Korea. The challenge is fundamental to the system of North Korea. I negotiated with North Korean counterparts, but you should never be under the illusion that you're negotiating with a person. You're negotiating with a system. And the system is deeply invested in the current power structure, and it's a totalitarian dictatorship. The moving that system in a certain direction towards some of the areas of compromise that we sought in normalization, in economic cooperation, in a permanent end to the war on the Korean Peninsula, which is in a stasis right now with a armistice, but it's still an active war of sorts, at least unresolved by a treaty. Our goal in this diplomacy was never regime change. In fact, President Trump was quite committed. If you have read in some of the reporting or some of the books about his communications with Kim Jong-un, he often inserted himself this phrase, "under your leadership," that will transform the Korean Peninsula under your leadership. He was trying to channel to Kim Jong-un that we weren't trying to remove him or replace him. We were trying to change the dynamic of the relationship. But I have to be honest that while regime change was never, ever our policy, the inevitable outcome of our policy would have been a change in the regime. And maybe not a change in the personalities, but a change in the system, because you cannot maintain that totalitarian dictatorship and have foreign trade and visiting tourists and allowing your citizens to travel outside the country and exchanges and a peace treaty and transparency mechanisms between your militaries. You're basically attacking and disassembling the fundamental elements of the hostile relationship that Kim Jong-un and his predecessors in power, his father and grandfather, have exploited to justify the most inhumane system of government that exists in the face of the world today.
I'd probably put the Taliban up there with them.
Okay, fair enough. Our challenge is to figure out how to untie that Gordian knot. And our frustration, if there was any, wasn't a lack of backing I had. It's the North Koreans just go into protracted periods of silence, and they retreat, and we can't get them to come out and engage. And I know there's a frustration, or maybe not a frustration, but that would be an experience that you all have had. It's one that we had for long periods, even in the midst of our diplomacy. What I would do if I was going to in a new administration is I wouldn't be overly eager, and I wouldn't offer unilateral concessions. The North Koreans generally want concessions in exchange for simply picking up the phone, and I would not indulge in that. But I would try to strike a tone that suggests the willingness to talk to them, because the gravity of the military means that they have requires that of us. And I would also be a little more active on the issue around them, the old cliche of motion in lieu of progress. I would put a lot more motion out there into this. That's not concessions. That's not ignoring the deeply flawed human rights record or the fate of the North Korean people, but more motion and then see. But I don't think just standing back and waiting them out is working for us. And I'm afraid that the threat has metastasized beyond where it was even just a few years ago.
Well, the only thing worse than the North Koreans refusing to negotiate is the North Koreans coming and demanding that we sit at the table to negotiate the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Korea and Japan.
So I have to say on that, his father was in a somewhat different place. And, someday we'll have a real reckoning of history. It's too soon to do that. But I do believe there was a moment.
Yeah.
And we missed it.
There were many moments that I can't wait until that day, inevitably, when the archives are opened. I'm going to be like in the line waiting to go and read. Like, what in the heck were they thinking? Yeah. It's a tough one, and it's bedeviled American diplomacy, American foreign policy for 30 years now.
Well, I'd like to know what the heck I was thinking when I imagined that I could get Wendy Sherman and Steve Biegun to talking, and that we could have a program in 60 minutes, because we're already at minute 55 and I haven't turned to the audience. I apologize. So let me quickly ask, I see Ambassador Ray Burkhart there. We'll give you the microphone.
One area of, used to be an important area of American leadership, international leadership, was trade. We have essentially withdrawn as leaders on the issue of international trade. In Asia, the Japanese picked up the baton. Fortunately, somebody did a pretty good job. Is this a permanent sort of bipartisan agreement that we don't want to do trade agreements that have anything to do with market opening anymore? Or do you expect there might be some evolution on that subject? Because it seems to have sort of withdrawn from our toolkit an important tool, an important aspect of international relations that other countries care about.
Yeah. So if we were designing our policy so that the bait would be attractive to the fish rather than the fishermen, trade would definitely be, front-footed on that. I can explain analytically, Ray, while at this moment I don't think it's possible. I certainly hope it's not a permanent condition, and I think it's a huge deficiency in American leadership in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, that trade is not front and center on that. So I completely agree with your implied concern there. But I can also analytically tell you why at this moment I don't think it's possible. And one of the factors is the momentary politics in our country. Neither candidate for president would be advocating for trade liberalization or market access in negotiations. But I also think we're going through a period of correction from some of the excesses of globalization. It's just going to take a little while to sort through societally, because there were excesses in that, what I consider globalization really to be the period 2000 to 2015, starting with China's entry into the WTO and ending with pretty much towards the end of President Obama's second term. And during that period, the United States created fabulous wealth in the United States of America through its trade policies. Our major corporations succeeded spectacularly. But I think it's also a fair critique that the benefits were not felt at every level of society. And I don't think you can separate this out from things like the fentanyl epidemic in Appalachia, or the urban decay in places like the city of Detroit or the industrial Midwest. I don't think we had the right balance in that period of globalization, and we're going to have to get there, get on a little bit better footing on that, and before we have the right incentives for our political candidates to be voicing some level of support for this. I think we'll get back there, but I think we may even be on the journey back there through things like investing in our own infrastructure, which I think was a great step forward to trying to correct some of those excesses.
The one thing I will add to it that makes it even more complicated now, Ray, is technology. Part of what happened is, as globalization happened and jobs were lost, particularly in parts of our country, manufacturing was left this country in many ways. We had no way to help people. We didn't have really any assistance program of any merit that really helped people who were dislocated from their jobs. Technology is going to make that happen again, as people who now have jobs may be replaced over time by technology or by robots. Some of that's happened already, not just in our country, but all over the world. And so one of the real challenges, particularly for the young people sitting here, not for me, I'm going to go off and enjoy my retirement, is to think about what to do to help people who get dislocated from change. Because change will happen, and technology, which is here, this is not a 30 or 40 year industrial revolution, this is here, now, happening. And so how do we help people so that if you're a guy who is in the Midwest and you were on a manufacturing line and you made really good money and now you're taking a computer coding course and in 2 years you'll make half of what you made on that manufacturing line and your whole community has changed. People don't look like you, they don't speak your language, they don't go to your church. People can get married who you thought were nice women down the street, but really, your wife now has to go to work to help the family income. There are a lot of consequences, and we did not, I think, adequately, Republican and Democrat. I hold us all responsible for not really thinking through what we needed to do to backstop people and backstop families. And I think we're going to go through this again because of technology. And so we need to be very mindful of this. It's why there has been bipartisan support for the CHIPS Act and for the infrastructure program, because people understand that we have to invest in our own country to make ourselves strong internationally and to ensure that people and young people have a future.
Well, Wendy, you're holding us responsible for not having adequately thought through the future, and I'm holding myself responsible for not adequately budgeting time for questions. I'm really sorry, but we are at time. All my fault. That said, you had a rare opportunity to hear on leadership from real leaders of U.S. foreign policy, and you've both made invaluable contributions over the years, and for that, I and we are certainly grateful. This conversation will be posted on the Asia Society website, on our Facebook, on our YouTube channel. I hope all of you and everyone who watches is a member or joins Asia Society, so you can be part of our terrific range of programs on policy like today, but also on arts and culture and education. So please join me in sincere thanks and admiration for Steve and for Wendy.